Declassified. July 15, 1944. The acrid smell of diesel fuel and burning metal hung heavy in the air across the muddy fields of northern France, where the morning mist still clung to the hedgerows like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their grip on the war-torn landscape. Staff Sergeant Tommy "Wrench" Martinez crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a Sherman tank, its hull now a blackened shell that spoke to the devastating efficiency of German anti-tank warfare. The sound of incoming artillery whistled overhead, followed by the earth-shaking thuds that sent tremors through his boots and up his spine, each impact a reminder that death could arrive at any moment from any direction. The hedgerow country of Normandy had become a nightmare for Allied armor, a geometric maze of ancient earthen walls topped with centuries-old vegetation that had been transformed into the perfect defensive network by Wehrmacht engineers who understood how to turn France's pastoral beauty into a killing field. Martinez wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a streak of clean skin that stood out against the dirt and oil stains that had become his permanent complexion since the landing at Omaha Beach 3 weeks earlier. The temperature had climbed steadily as the morning progressed, and now the sun beat down mercilessly on the metal surfaces of damaged vehicles, creating an oven-like environment that made every movement feel like wading through thick honey. Around him, the scattered remains of the 3rd Armored Division's latest assault told a story of tactical frustration that had become all too familiar in this bocage country. 14 Sherman tanks lay disabled or destroyed within a radius of just 200 yards, their crews either dead, wounded, or huddled in whatever cover they could find while German machine gun fire swept the open ground between the hedgerows with mechanical precision. The morning's attack had lasted exactly 7 minutes from the moment the first tank had rumbled through the gap in the hedgerow until the last surviving Sherman had limped back to the relative safety of the Allied lines, trailing smoke and leaving a track of oil that marked their retreat like a wounded animal's blood trail. Martinez counted the casualties in his head, a grim accounting that had become second nature after weeks of similar disasters. 42 tank crew members dead or wounded, millions of dollars in equipment reduced to scrap metal, and worst of all, absolutely nothing to show for it except the bitter knowledge that tomorrow would likely bring another equally futile assault against the same impregnable positions. The German defenders had turned each hedgerow into a fortress, with carefully concealed Panzerfaust teams positioned to catch Allied armor in devastating crossfires the moment they broke through the narrow gaps that served as the only passages between fields. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Martinez to tighten his grip on the wrench that had given him his nickname, a massive adjustable tool that had been his constant companion since his days working on farm equipment back in New Mexico. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison appeared around the corner of the destroyed tank, his uniform torn and stained with mud, his face bearing the haggard expression of a commander who had watched too many good men die in pursuit of objectives that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Harrison's eyes met Martinez's, and in that moment of silent communication, both men acknowledged the terrible mathematics of their situation. "How many more can we lose like this, Martinez?" Harrison asked, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of sniper fire from the German positions. "Division wants this sector cleared by tomorrow evening, but at this rate, we'll run out of tanks before we run out of hedgerows." The colonel's question hung in the air between them like a challenge, though both men knew it was really an expression of desperation disguised as tactical assessment. Martinez had been studying the problem for days, watching attack after attack fail against the same fundamental challenge. The hedgerows created natural choke points that German defenders could cover with devastating effectiveness, turning each attempted breakthrough into a predictable killing zone where Allied armor became sitting ducks for concealed anti-tank weapons. Traditional doctrine called for infantry and armor coordination, but the thick vegetation and narrow passages made such coordination nearly impossible, leaving tank crews to advance blindly into prepared positions while supporting infantry struggled to keep pace through the maze of earthen walls and thorny undergrowth. But Martinez had noticed something that the officers and tactical experts had missed, a pattern in the German defensive system that revealed a potential weakness hidden beneath layers of apparent strength. During his years as a mechanic, first on his family's farm and later at a Caterpillar dealership in Albuquerque, he had learned to see mechanical systems not just as collections of individual components, but as integrated networks where the failure of one element could cascade through the entire structure. The German defensive positions showed the same kind of systematic integration, which meant they might also share the same vulnerability to cascade failure if the right pressure were applied at the right point. The idea that had been forming in Martinez's mind seemed almost insultingly simple, the kind of solution that experts would dismiss as naive because it didn't account for the sophisticated complexities of modern warfare. Yet as he watched another group of medics carry wounded tank crew members back from the failed morning assault, Martinez couldn't shake the conviction that sometimes the most effective solutions were the ones that everybody else was too educated to consider. The German defenders had created a system of interlocking fields of fire and mutually supporting positions, but like any system, it depended on communication and coordination to function effectively. What if that coordination could be disrupted not through massive firepower or complex tactical maneuvers, but through a simple mechanical intervention that exploited the enemy's own defensive strengths against them? Martinez had spent the previous evening studying captured German equipment and interrogation reports, piecing together a picture of how the enemy's defensive network actually functioned on a practical level. The answer he had arrived at seemed too straightforward to work, which was exactly why he thought it might succeed where more sophisticated approaches had failed. The distant sound of engines announced the arrival of replacement equipment from the rear echelon, fresh Sherman tanks that would probably be reduced to burning metal within hours if they were committed to action using the same failed tactics that had already cost so much in men and machinery. Martinez watched the new arrivals with a mixture of admiration for the courage of their crews and frustration at the predictable waste that their deployment represented. These young men would climb into their steel coffins tomorrow morning with the same confidence and determination that had characterized every previous assault, and they would die just as surely unless something fundamental changed in the Allied approach to this seemingly impossible tactical problem. Harrison noticed Martinez's expression and moved closer, lowering his voice to avoid being overheard by the tank crews who were already showing signs of the brittle morale that came with repeated exposure to hopeless situations. "You've got that look again, Sergeant. The same one you had right before you figured out how to get those engines running on watered-down fuel back in England." The colonel's tone carried a note of desperate hope that he was trying hard to conceal, but Martinez caught it anyway, recognizing the sound of a commander who was running out of options and grasping at any possibility of avoiding another massacre. Martinez nodded slowly, his mind already working through the practical details of what he was beginning to think might be possible. "Sir, what if I told you that we could disable every one of those German positions without firing a shot? What if I said we could turn their own defensive system against them using nothing but some basic mechanical principles and materials we already have right here in this repair depot?" The words sounded fantastic even as he spoke them, but Martinez had learned to trust his mechanical instincts even when they led him toward conclusions that defied conventional wisdom. The expression on Harrison's face shifted from skeptical curiosity to intense attention as he processed the implications of what Martinez was suggesting. In the distance, the sound of German voices carried on the evening breeze, a reminder that the enemy was close enough to overhear careless conversations, but also close enough for more creative forms of intervention. Tomorrow would bring another assault, another attempt to break through the hedgerow defenses using the same tactics that had already proven inadequate, unless Martinez could convince his superiors that there was another way forward. Tommy Martinez had not been born for war, but rather for the patient, methodical work of coaxing life from broken machinery and finding solutions to problems that others dismissed as impossible. His childhood in the high desert country of New Mexico had been shaped by the fundamental reality of scarcity, where nothing could be wasted and everything had to be made to work regardless of how unlikely the circumstances might seem. His father, Roberto Martinez, had run a small farm outside Las Cruces, scratching a living from stubborn soil with equipment that was already obsolete when the Great Depression made replacement parts a luxury the family could not afford. Young Tommy had learned to see mechanical systems as living things with their own personalities and quirks, developing an intuitive understanding of how components interacted that went far beyond the theoretical knowledge contained in repair manuals. By the time he was 12, he could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, distinguishing between the subtle variations in timing, compression, and fuel delivery that most experienced mechanics would need hours to identify through systematic testing. His reputation spread throughout the county, bringing farmers from dozens of miles away who had been told by professional shops that their equipment was beyond saving. The Martinez family workshop became a place where mechanical resurrection was routine, where Tommy would disappear for days at a time into the maze of disassembled engines and improvised tools that filled every available space in the barn behind their modest adobe house. His mother, Maria, would bring him meals and find him completely absorbed in some seemingly impossible repair project, his clothes black with grease and his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he crafted replacement parts from scavenged materials and pure ingenuity. When the Caterpillar dealership in Albuquerque offered Tommy a job in 1938, it represented both an opportunity and a departure from everything he had known. The dealership's modern facilities and proper tools were a revelation after years of improvisation, but Tommy quickly discovered that formal training could sometimes interfere with the intuitive problem-solving approaches that had made him successful in his father's workshop. The other mechanics were skilled professionals with certificates and specialized knowledge, but they often seemed paralyzed when confronted with problems that fell outside their established procedures. Tommy's breakthrough came during his third week at the dealership, when a customer brought in a massive D8 bulldozer that had been declared unrepairable by every other shop in the state. The machine's transmission had failed in a way that the manufacturer's technical experts claimed was impossible, creating a condition where replacement parts would cost more than the entire machine was worth. Tommy spent 2 days studying the problem, not just the failed transmission but the entire integrated system of which it was a part, until he identified a cascade failure that had started with a seemingly minor adjustment to the throttle linkage. The solution required fabricating a custom part that didn't exist in any catalog, using principles from hydraulic engineering that Tommy had learned by observing how water moved through the irrigation systems on his father's farm. When the bulldozer roared back to life after Tommy's modification, the sound drew mechanics from throughout the dealership, all of them eager to understand how he had accomplished what their combined expertise had declared impossible. The customer saved thousands of dollars, the dealership gained a reputation for solving unsolvable problems, and Tommy Martinez earned the nickname Wrench for his ability to find mechanical solutions where others saw only mechanical failure. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything, transforming Tommy's specialized skills from a source of personal satisfaction and modest prosperity into a potential contribution to national survival. The local draft board was initially inclined to grant him a deferment based on his essential role at the dealership, where he was now supervising a crew of mechanics maintaining agricultural equipment that was crucial to food production. But Tommy had listened to the radio reports of American defeats in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, understanding with mechanical clarity that this was a war that would be won or lost based on which side could keep its equipment running under impossible conditions. His decision to enlist came not from patriotic fervor but from a more practical recognition that his skills might be needed in places where improvisation could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The Army's mechanical training was both more and less than what Tommy had expected, providing him with formal knowledge of military equipment while sometimes conflicting with the intuitive approaches that had made him successful in civilian life. His drill sergeants appreciated his competence but were occasionally frustrated by his tendency to find unconventional solutions to standard problems. The incident that nearly ended Tommy's military career before it began occurred during advanced training at Fort Knox, when he was assigned to repair a tank engine that had been deliberately sabotaged as a training exercise. The official solution required following a complex diagnostic procedure that would have taken most mechanics 4 to 6 hours to complete, but Tommy identified the problem within minutes and had the engine running again before the instructors had finished explaining the exercise to the other students. His commanding officer, Major William Stockton, accused Tommy of cheating and threatened him with court-martial until a thorough investigation revealed that Tommy had simply used his civilian experience to recognize a pattern of failure that military training hadn't prepared the other mechanics to identify. Stockton's hostility toward Tommy's unorthodox methods created a tension that persisted throughout the rest of his training, with the major making it clear that he considered Tommy's civilian background more of a liability than an asset in military operations. The intervention that saved Tommy's career came from an unexpected source, Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a career soldier who had served in mechanized units since before the war and had learned to value results over procedures. Kowalski had watched Tommy work and recognized something that Major Stockton had missed: the young mechanic's ability to see mechanical systems as integrated wholes rather than collections of individual components made him uniquely valuable for the kind of field repairs that would be necessary in combat conditions. Kowalski's recommendation ensured that Tommy was assigned to a frontline armored unit rather than being relegated to rear echelon duties where his unconventional methods might be seen as disruptive rather than innovative. The Master Sergeant's final advice to Tommy was characteristically blunt: keep your mouth shut and your eyes open until you find officers who are smart enough to listen to what you have to tell them. This war is going to need mechanics who can think as well as wrench. The journey to England aboard a crowded troopship gave Tommy his first real exposure to the scale of the global conflict, as thousands of American soldiers shared stories of training, speculation about their eventual deployment, and growing awareness that they were part of something much larger than their individual experiences had prepared them to comprehend. The crossing took 2 weeks through submarine-infested waters, with every man aboard aware that German U-boats could send them to the bottom of the Atlantic with little warning and no possibility of rescue. Tommy's first glimpse of war-torn England came as their convoy approached Liverpool through waters littered with the debris of previous battles, passing the rusted hulks of merchant vessels that had not been fortunate enough to complete their Atlantic crossing. The sight of bomb damage in English cities provided a sobering preview of what awaited the American forces when they eventually crossed the Channel, while the steady stream of wounded soldiers returning from North Africa and Italy offered unmistakable evidence that this war would test every skill and resource the Allies could muster. The enormous German stronghold stretched across the Norman countryside like a geometric cancer, transforming France's ancient agricultural landscape into a precisely engineered killing machine that had been 3 years in the construction. Each hedgerow had been surveyed, measured, and modified according to defensive principles that Wehrmacht engineers had refined through bitter experience on the Eastern Front, creating interlocking fields of fire that could destroy entire armored formations within minutes of their exposure. The Bocage country of Normandy had been selected by German defensive planners precisely because its natural characteristics could be enhanced rather than overcome, turning geographical features that had defined rural French life for centuries into components of a military system designed to bleed Allied forces white in a war of attrition that Germany might still win despite its strategic disadvantages. The hedgerows themselves were ancient earthen embankments topped with thorny vegetation that had been planted centuries earlier to divide fields and provide windbreaks, but German engineers had transformed them into fortified positions by adding concrete bunkers, carefully positioned machine gun nests, and concealed observation posts that could direct artillery fire with devastating precision. Allied intelligence estimates suggested that German forces in the sector numbered approximately 800 combat troops, including veteran Panzergrenadier units that had been withdrawn from the Russian front specifically to defend against the anticipated invasion. These were not the second-rate garrison troops that Allied planners had hoped to encounter, but experienced soldiers who understood both the theoretical principles and practical realities of defensive warfare against mechanically superior opponents. The German defensive system relied on a sophisticated network of communication trenches and underground telephone lines that allowed isolated strongpoints to coordinate their fires and call for immediate artillery support when Allied forces attempted to break through at any point. Each hedgerow position was designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where concealed anti-tank guns could engage Allied armor at ranges that made return fire ineffective, while machine gun teams positioned in mutually supporting positions could sweep the approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Previous Allied attempts to break through the German defenses had followed predictable patterns that Wehrmacht tactical experts had studied and countered with systematic precision. Artillery bombardments that were supposed to suppress German positions instead warned defenders of impending attacks, giving them time to take cover in prepared bunkers and emerge to man their weapons as soon as Allied infantry and armor began their assault. Tank infantry coordination that worked effectively in open terrain became impossible in the confined spaces between hedgerows, where visibility was limited to a few yards and communication between units broke down almost immediately. The failure rate of Allied attacks in this sector had reached levels that threatened to undermine morale throughout the entire expeditionary force, with some units suffering casualty rates exceeding 50% in single days fighting for gains measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Division commanders were under increasing pressure from Corps headquarters to produce results that justified the enormous investment in men and equipment that the Normandy campaign represented, but the tactical realities on the ground seemed to make significant progress impossible without casualties that would cripple Allied offensive capabilities for months to come. Tommy Martinez had been observing these failed attacks with the systematic attention to detail that he had learned during years of diagnosing mechanical failures, noting patterns and relationships that others missed because they were focused on immediate tactical problems rather than underlying systemic issues. His position as a repair specialist gave him access to damaged equipment and wounded personnel from multiple units, allowing him to piece together a comprehensive picture of how the German defensive system actually functioned on an operational level. The pattern that emerged from Tommy's analysis was both more sophisticated and more vulnerable than Allied intelligence assessments had suggested. German defenders were using the bocage terrain to create what amounted to a giant mechanical system, with each individual position serving as a component in an integrated network that could concentrate overwhelming firepower at any point where Allied forces attempted to break through. The system's strength lay in its redundancy and mutual support, but these same characteristics also created dependencies that could be exploited by someone who understood how mechanical systems could be made to fail through cascade effects. Tommy's civilian experience had taught him that complex systems often contained single points of failure that were hidden beneath layers of apparent redundancy, and that identifying these critical nodes required understanding not just how components were supposed to work, but how they actually worked under stress conditions. The German defensive network showed the same kind of systematic vulnerabilities that Tommy had learned to identify in failed agricultural equipment, where the breakdown of one seemingly minor component could trigger failures throughout an entire integrated system. The key insight came when Tommy realized that the German communication system, which was the network's greatest strength, also represented its most critical vulnerability. The elaborate telephone lines and coordination procedures that allowed isolated strongpoints to call for artillery support and coordinate their fires with adjacent positions also created dependencies that could be exploited through relatively simple mechanical interventions applied at the right points with proper timing. Tommy's idea was to use the Germans' own coordination system against them by creating mechanical failures that would cascade through their communication network, disrupting the timing and coordination that made their defensive system so effective. The specific technique he had in mind drew on principles from hydraulic engineering and electrical systems that Tommy had learned during his civilian career, adapted to military applications that no formal training program had ever considered because they fell outside established tactical doctrine. The innovation that Tommy Martinez proposed seemed so fundamentally simple that experienced officers dismissed it as naive, the kind of solution that someone with limited military education might suggest because he didn't understand the sophisticated complexities of modern warfare. What Tommy was suggesting amounted to mechanical sabotage on a scale that could theoretically disable an entire defensive sector, but using materials and techniques that were so basic that any competent mechanic could improvise them from standard military supplies. The core concept involved creating precisely timed mechanical failures in the German communication system that would trigger a cascade of coordination breakdowns throughout their defensive network. Tommy had identified the critical vulnerability during his study of captured German equipment and interrogation reports from prisoners, recognizing that the enemy's sophisticated communication system depended on a network of field telephone lines that were vulnerable to a specific type of mechanical interference that could be delivered using improvised devices constructed from readily available materials. The first component of Tommy's system was a modified timing mechanism salvaged from damaged tank equipment, a precision device that could be calibrated to activate mechanical switches at predetermined intervals with accuracy measured in seconds rather than minutes. Tommy had learned to construct such timing mechanisms during his civilian work, where automated irrigation systems required precise coordination of multiple mechanical processes over extended periods without human intervention. The timing mechanism would control a series of mechanical switches that could be positioned along German communication lines at points where the cables were most vulnerable to specific types of interference. These switches would be activated in a carefully choreographed sequence designed to create the appearance of random equipment failures while actually implementing a systematic disruption of the enemy's coordination capabilities that would cascade through their entire defensive network. The second component was even simpler in concept but required more sophisticated understanding of electrical and hydraulic principles to implement effectively. Tommy proposed using modified military radio batteries to create electromagnetic pulses that could disrupt German radio communications without producing the obvious signatures that would alert enemy technicians to deliberate sabotage. The technique involved overloading battery systems in a controlled manner that would generate brief but powerful electromagnetic emissions, similar to the natural phenomena that occasionally disrupted radio communications during thunderstorms. These electromagnetic pulses would be timed to coincide with the mechanical disruption of telephone communications, creating a situation where German defenders would lose both primary and backup communication systems simultaneously. Without reliable communication, the sophisticated coordination that made their defensive system effective would collapse, leaving individual strongpoints isolated and unable to call for artillery support or coordinate their fires with adjacent positions. The third component of Tommy's system addressed the challenge of delivery and positioning, using principles from his experience with agricultural machinery to design deployment mechanisms that could place the sabotage devices at optimal locations without requiring direct human intervention that would expose Allied personnel to enemy fire. The delivery system used modified artillery shells that had been gutted and refitted with timing mechanisms and deployment charges, allowing the sabotage devices to be delivered by indirect fire from positions safely behind Allied lines. The modified shells would detonate at predetermined altitudes, scattering the sabotage devices across the target area where they would automatically position themselves along German communication lines using simple mechanical systems that Tommy had adapted from farm equipment designs. Each device would then activate according to its programmed timing sequence, creating the cascade of communication failures that would disable the German defensive network without alerting enemy forces to the true nature of the attack. Tommy's explanation of the technical principles involved in his system demonstrated a level of mechanical sophistication that impressed even skeptical officers, but the simplicity of the basic concept continued to generate resistance from military professionals who had been trained to think in terms of conventional tactical solutions. The idea that such a complex defensive system could be defeated through what amounted to mechanical sabotage seemed to violate fundamental principles of military science that emphasized the superiority of sophisticated solutions over simple ones. The physics underlying Tommy's system were actually quite straightforward, involving nothing more exotic than the controlled application of electromagnetic and mechanical forces to disrupt communication systems that were designed to be robust but not necessarily resistant to the specific types of interference that Tommy was proposing to generate. The German engineers who had designed the communication network had anticipated conventional forms of attack such as artillery bombardment and direct assault, but had not considered the possibility that someone might use their system's own characteristics to create cascade failures from within. Tommy's testing process involved constructing scaled-down versions of each component using materials available in the forward repair depot, allowing him to verify the basic principles without requiring access to resources that would alert higher headquarters to his unauthorized experimentation. The initial tests were conducted during off-duty hours using damaged equipment that was scheduled for salvage, providing Tommy with the opportunity to refine his designs based on actual performance data rather than theoretical calculations. The first successful test occurred on a rainy evening in early July, when Tommy's improvised timing mechanism successfully activated a series of mechanical switches with the precision necessary to coordinate multiple simultaneous actions. The second test demonstrated that his electromagnetic pulse generator could disrupt radio communications at distances up to several hundred yards, while the third test proved that his delivery system could accurately place devices at predetermined locations using modified artillery shells fired from a standard Allied howitzer. The cascade effect that Tommy had predicted became visible during his fourth test, when the simultaneous failure of multiple communication links created a feedback loop that amplified the initial disruption far beyond what would have been expected from the individual component failures. This demonstration convinced Tommy that his system could indeed create the kind of systematic breakdown that would disable an entire defensive sector, but it also highlighted the importance of precise timing in achieving the desired results. Convincing his commanding officers to authorize an actual combat test required Tommy to present his system not as an experimental innovation but as a proven technique that could achieve specific tactical objectives with minimal risk to Allied personnel. The demonstration he arranged for Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the divisional staff showed each component of the system operating under controlled conditions, providing empirical evidence that the theoretical principles could be translated into practical military applications. The final preparations for the combat test involved positioning Tommy's devices at carefully selected points around the German defensive perimeter, using intelligence gathered from previous reconnaissance missions to identify the locations where communication lines were most vulnerable to mechanical interference. The timing sequences were programmed to create a wave of failures that would begin at the northern end of the German sector and cascade southward over a period of exactly 7 minutes, long enough to disable the entire defensive network but brief enough to prevent German technicians from identifying and countering the source of their communication problems. July 16, 1944, 0530 hours. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the Norman countryside like a wet blanket, broken only by the distant flicker of artillery flashes on the horizon and the occasional white-hot streak of a flare drifting slowly earthward under its tiny parachute. Tommy Martinez crouched in a muddy shell crater that had been carved by German artillery 3 days earlier, his hands steady despite the cold that had settled into his bones during the long night of final preparations. The modified timing devices were positioned and armed, their internal mechanisms already counting down the minutes until the carefully choreographed sequence of failures would begin. The German positions lay silent in the pre-dawn gloom, their defenders undoubtedly alert but confident in the strength of defensive preparations that had already proven their worth against repeated Allied assaults. Machine gun teams occupied positions that had been surveyed with mathematical precision, while anti-tank gun crews waited beside weapons that could destroy any Allied armor foolish enough to expose itself in the killing zones between hedgerows. The communication network that coordinated their fires hummed with routine traffic as officers checked equipment and confirmed readiness for another day of defensive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the radio headset that connected Tommy to the Allied command post, where staff officers were monitoring intelligence reports and weather conditions with the nervous attention that preceded major operations. Wrench, we're showing German patrol activity in Sector 7. Are you certain your devices won't be discovered before activation? The colonel's concern was understandable, given that the entire operation depended on maintaining the element of surprise until Tommy's cascade failure could disable the enemy communication system. Tommy checked his watch and verified that the countdown was proceeding according to plan, with the first activation scheduled to occur in exactly 12 minutes. Sir, the devices are camouflaged and positioned along existing cable runs where German technicians won't notice them unless they're specifically looking for sabotage equipment. We should be good to go. His confidence was based on detailed study of German maintenance procedures, which focused on repairing obvious damage rather than searching for concealed threats to system integrity. The first phase of Tommy's attack began at exactly 0547 hours, when the northernmost timing device activated its electromagnetic pulse generator and simultaneously triggered a mechanical switch that severed a critical telephone cable junction serving 3 German strongpoints. The electromagnetic pulse lasted only 3 seconds, but it was sufficient to disrupt radio communications throughout the northern sector while the severed cable eliminated backup communication between the affected positions and their artillery support. German reaction was immediate but confused, as communications personnel attempted to diagnose what appeared to be routine equipment failures occurring with unusually bad timing. The duty officer at the sector headquarters attempted to contact the affected strongpoints using alternate communication channels, but found that these backup systems were also experiencing intermittent failures that prevented reliable coordination of defensive fires. The second phase activation occurred 90 seconds later, when devices positioned along the central communication network created a new wave of simultaneous failures that expanded the communication blackout to include 6 additional strongpoints and the forward artillery observation post responsible for directing German counter-battery fires. The cascade effect that Tommy had predicted began to manifest as communication failures in one area created increased traffic loads on surviving networks, pushing them beyond their designed capacity and causing additional failures that amplified the original disruption. By 0550 hours, the German defensive network had lost communication with more than half of its strongpoints, while the remaining positions found their communication links increasingly unreliable as the cascade effect continued to spread through systems that had been designed to be robust but were proving vulnerable to this specific form of coordinated attack. German artillery, unable to receive accurate targeting information from forward observers, began firing pre-planned defensive fires that were based on outdated intelligence and proved ineffective against Allied forces that were already positioning themselves to exploit the communication breakdown. The third phase of Tommy's attack struck at 0552 hours, completing the systematic isolation of German defensive positions by severing the remaining communication links between individual strongpoints and their supporting artillery. The timing devices had performed with mechanical precision, creating a wave of failures that began in the north and swept southward through the entire defensive sector in exactly the sequence that Tommy had designed to maximize cascade effects while minimizing the possibility that German technicians could identify the source of their problems. German defenders found themselves fighting as isolated units without the coordination that had made their defensive system so effective against previous Allied attacks. Machine gun teams could no longer coordinate their fires with adjacent positions, anti-tank gun crews received no warning of Allied movements in other sectors, and artillery support became sporadic and inaccurate as forward observers struggled with communication equipment that functioned intermittently or not at all. The Allied assault that followed exploited the communication breakdown with systematic efficiency, using infiltration tactics that would have been impossible against a coordinated defense but proved devastatingly effective against isolated strongpoints that could no longer call for mutual support. Tank infantry teams advanced through gaps in the German defensive line that opened automatically as individual positions fell without their neighbors being warned of the breakthrough. Tommy watched the cascade of German defensive collapses from his observation post, timing each successive failure against his watch and noting how closely the actual sequence matched his theoretical predictions. The first strongpoint fell at 0554 hours when its crew abandoned their position after losing communication with supporting units and finding themselves exposed to Allied infantry attacks that they could not counter without artillery support. The second position lasted until 0556 hours before its defenders withdrew under pressure from Allied tanks that approached from directions that should have been covered by adjacent strongpoints. By 0600 hours, the entire German defensive sector had collapsed in a cascade of abandonment and withdrawal that left Allied forces in control of objectives that had been considered unassailable just minutes earlier. The 14 German strongpoints that had dominated this section of the front for months had been neutralized without requiring the massive casualties that previous attacks had demanded, proving that Tommy's mechanical approach to warfare could achieve tactical results that conventional military thinking had declared impossible. The immediate aftermath of the operation saw German forces attempting to establish new defensive positions farther inland, but their withdrawal was hampered by the same communication problems that had caused the collapse of their original defensive line. Allied forces pressed their advantage with speed and determination, advancing several miles before German resistance could reorganize sufficiently to halt their progress. Colonel Harrison's assessment of the operation focused on its broader implications rather than just the immediate tactical success. Martinez, what you've accomplished here changes how we think about defensive systems. If this technique can be refined and applied on a larger scale, it could break the stalemate that's been bleeding us white for the past month. The colonel's enthusiasm was tempered by awareness that higher headquarters would require detailed documentation before approving wider implementation of Tommy's methods. The technical success of Tommy's system exceeded even his own optimistic projections, with every device functioning according to specification and the cascade effects proving more powerful than theoretical calculations had suggested. The combination of electromagnetic pulses and mechanical sabotage had created synergistic effects that amplified the impact of each individual component, demonstrating that properly coordinated simple technologies could overcome sophisticated defensive systems through systematic exploitation of their inherent vulnerabilities. German prisoners captured during the operation provided valuable intelligence about the enemy's perspective on what had caused their defensive collapse, revealing that Wehrmacht technicians had attributed the communication failures to a combination of equipment fatigue, weather effects, and routine maintenance problems rather than recognizing the systematic nature of the attack. This intelligence confirmed Tommy's prediction that his sabotage techniques would be difficult for enemy forces to identify and counter, making them suitable for repeated use in similar tactical situations. The broader recognition of Tommy Martinez's contribution to Allied tactical capabilities began with his immediate promotion to technical sergeant and assignment to divisional headquarters, where his expertise in mechanical sabotage could be applied to planning future operations against German defensive positions. The Army's Ordnance Corps expressed interest in standardizing his techniques for wider deployment, while intelligence specialists began studying the broader applications of cascade failure principles to strategic targets throughout occupied Europe. Tommy's own reaction to his sudden fame was characteristically modest, focusing on the technical challenges of refining his systems rather than the personal recognition that his success had generated. "It's just applied mechanics, sir. The same principles that work on farm equipment work on military systems, if you understand how to identify the critical failure points." His explanation demonstrated the practical mindset that had made his innovation possible, treating military problems as mechanical challenges that could be solved through systematic analysis and creative application of established engineering principles. The Purple Heart that Tommy received for wounds suffered during the operation's reconnaissance phase was supplemented by the Silver Star for gallantry in action and the Legion of Merit for his contribution to Allied tactical capabilities. His hometown newspaper in Las Cruces featured a front-page story about the local farm boy who had revolutionized military engineering, while Caterpillar Corporation offered him a position as chief engineer with a salary that reflected their recognition of his unique talents. Tommy's post-war career combined his military experience with his civilian engineering background, leading to consulting contracts with agricultural equipment manufacturers who wanted to apply his cascade failure analysis techniques to improving the reliability of complex mechanical systems. His approach to engineering problems, which emphasized understanding system-level interactions rather than focusing on individual component performance, influenced a generation of engineers who learned to think about mechanical systems as integrated networks rather than collections of separate parts. The military applications of Tommy's techniques extended far beyond the specific tactical situation where they had first proven successful, contributing to the development of electronic warfare systems and communication disruption technologies that remained classified for decades after the war's end. His insights into cascade failure analysis became foundational principles in the emerging field of systems engineering, where understanding how component failures could propagate through complex networks proved crucial to designing robust technological systems. Tommy Martinez died peacefully in 1987 at the age of 68, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories of his wartime service without fully understanding the technical innovations that had made his reputation. His funeral in Las Cruces drew representatives from military engineering units, agricultural equipment manufacturers, and engineering schools throughout the Southwest, all of whom recognized their debt to his pioneering work in applied systems analysis. The Tommy Martinez Memorial Workshop at New Mexico State University continues to teach his approach to mechanical problem solving, emphasizing the integration of theoretical knowledge with practical experience that made his wartime innovations possible. Students learn to think about complex systems in terms of their vulnerability to cascade failures, developing skills that prove valuable in fields ranging from aerospace engineering to computer network security. Modern military doctrine acknowledges Tommy's contribution to the development of information warfare techniques, recognizing that his mechanical approach to disrupting enemy communication systems anticipated many of the principles that govern contemporary cyber warfare. The cascade failure analysis that he developed for mechanical systems has evolved into sophisticated computer models that help military planners identify vulnerabilities in enemy networks that can be exploited through relatively simple interventions applied at critical points. The ultimate lesson of Tommy Martinez's wartime service lies not in the specific techniques he developed, but in his demonstration that innovative solutions often emerge from the intersection of specialized technical knowledge and creative thinking about practical problems. His success in applying civilian engineering principles to military challenges illustrates the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex problems, while his cascade failure analysis provides a framework for understanding how systematic approaches can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. The 14 German strongpoints that fell in 7 minutes on that July morning in 1944 represented more than a tactical victory. They demonstrated that mechanical thinking could revolutionize military operations by identifying and exploiting the hidden vulnerabilities that exist within even the most sophisticated defensive systems. Tommy's wrench had indeed changed the course of the war, one precisely timed mechanical failure at a time.